Hey guys, so today we are going to be doing the world's fastest overview of the Cold War. But before we can do that, we have to jump into what the world looked like immediately following the end of World War II with the surrender of the Germans and the Japanese. So, the first thing you have to understand is that we are still within living memory of World War I. People remember the terrible things that happened as a result of the Treaty of Versailles. So almost immediately, the world powers, the Allied powers, when they realize that they're probably going to win this war, they start putting together a plan for victory that avoids the same problem. They listen to their history teachers and learn from their history. So they start putting together a plan in order to avoid making the same mistakes that they made with the Treaty of Versailles. And namely, this applies to what's going to happen to the Axis powers. So the first is Germany. Germany is obviously at fault for this war, but they are not blamed in the same way they were with the Treaty of Versailles. So, what they decide to do is divide and occupy Germany. So basically, what they do is they divide Germany into four pieces, and each of the pieces goes to one of the major Allied powers. So we've got Britain, France, the United States, and the Soviet Union. And the idea behind this is that each of these nations are going to be able to pour resources, supplies, money, all of these things into their specific region in order to rebuild that part of Germany. And if you zoom in here, you can also see the city of Berlin is also divided. Now, it is important that the city of Berlin is inside the Soviet territory. Hold on to that thought. But the point of this here is, as I said, in order to make sure that Germany can rebuild and not, again, follow the same problems that happened after World War I. The next is Japan. Japan is also occupied. This photograph here shows General George MacArthur, or Douglas MacArthur, rather, and the Prime Minister of Japan. They stripped some power away from the Japanese Empire, write a new constitution, and Japan kind of goes through an economic revival. Not long after the war ends, Japan becomes allies with the United States. So they went from being, the people that we fought the hardest to one of our most important Asian allies. Really, a lot of the, reason that Japan has some economic powerhouse today can be thanks to this new constitution that is written at the end of World War II. Next is the Italian monarchy, which collapses. Picture is of King Umberto II, the last king of Italy. He has run out of town on a rail. A republic is established in Italy, and again, an economic miracle kind of happens in Italy after the fall of the Italian monarchy. All of these nations are allowed to rebuild with the help of the Allied powers. So, really avoiding those same problems. Last but not least is we have the Nuremberg trials. So, the Nuremberg trials took all of the Nazi leaders who were left that had not died or committed suicide or escaped and put them on trial for their crimes against humanity. The Nuremberg trials was the first time this phrase crimes against humanity even exists. For the Holocaust and the other things that happened during World War II to civilian populations, and held the Nazis accountable for those crimes that they committed. And it's one of the first times in modern history that something like this happens. After this, it leads to some massive rebuilding that has to take place in Europe and Asia. And the best way that that happens is through something called the Marshall Plan. So, this is a plan come up by George Marshall, who was the Secretary of State of the United States at the time. And basically, this plan focuses on the United States giving monetary aid to European countries in hopes to help them rebuild those countries. As you can see, most of that money went to Great Britain and France, but to other places in Central Europe as well. But one thing you will notice if you look at this map, it did not go to the Soviet Union, and it did not go to many of the Eastern European countries that are along the border of the Soviet Union. This is the first hint of the increased tension that now exists between these two major world superpowers. So the United States and the USSR, the Soviet Union, really come out as the top two countries from World War II. But it also leads to some increased tension, which we're going to get to in just a minute. Next, the United Nations is formed. The United Nations is formed from the downfall of the League of Nations. The League of Nations did not work. It was ineffective. The United States never even joined it. But the United Nations is formed in its downfall as a way to, again, as a peacekeeping organization, but one that now has a little bit of force behind it. And the idea of the UN is to have all of the countries of the world be able to work together to come to peaceful solutions. Obviously, the UN is still a major presence in our world today. Last but not least is colonies of the major powers of Europe, specifically in Asia and Africa, begin movements for independence and decolonization. And we are going to see as a result of this that many of the colonies that still existed in these European powers are finally going to gain their independence, which leads us to the Cold War. So the Cold War takes place from 1945 to 1991, and it really defines modern world history. So let's jump right in. Well, when we say cold, what we mean are tensions. It is an almost war, right? Cold War is not a war where people are actually fighting each other, but we are so close to fighting each other. The tensions are between the United States and the Soviet Union, and it all comes down to which is better, democracy and capitalism or communism. And I mean, again, the United States and the Soviet Union were allies during World War II, and this starts almost immediately by the end of World War II. And the whole thing is really an ideological conflict as much as anything else. This idea that communism is dangerous and we want to keep it from spreading, which brings us to the goal of the United States, something called containment. So the containment policy was part of what's known as the Truman Doctrine. And it's this idea that communism exists in some countries already. Fine. Your Soviet Union, you can remain communist if you want, but we want to keep it where it is. We don't let it spread. And the way I like to think about it is think about like a container in your fridge. If you've got some leftovers, let's say you made a big old pot of tomato soup, right? And you eat the tomato soup, but you couldn't finish all of it, so you don't want to get rid of it. You don't want to throw the tomato soup away. But you also can't just take the pot of tomato soup and pour it into your refrigerator because then it'll get all over your Chinese takeout and your pho. So what you do instead is you put it in a container so that it doesn't spread everywhere. And that's basically what the goal of the United States is in terms of communism. Contain it where it is, don't let it spread. Which brings us to the Berlin Airlift. So as we mentioned, Germany is divided after World War II from the Allied powers, but after tensions start to increase between the Soviet Union and the other Allied powers, the Soviets block the Allies from getting into the city of Berlin. Now, Berlin was divided, but it is within Soviet territory. And the people of Berlin start to really suffer. They need medical supplies, food, fuel, and those supplies can't get in. The Soviets have blockaded all of the streets and the rivers into the city. And so we see the suffering really starting to begin here. So the United States comes with a solution. They're going to fly in those supplies, right? This is the airlift part of them. So they fly in, drop the supplies off, and fly back to Allied territory. Now you might ask, why did the Soviets allow this? Obviously, this is a problem, right? Because the Soviets, they have weapons. They didn't want this to happen. But you have to remember, the United States has a very different weapon now. And that weapon is atomic. And because of the atomic bomb, the Soviets are hesitant to engage the Allied powers in this. But what happens as a result? Eventually, the Berlin Wall is built. The Berlin Wall surrounds West Berlin because East Berliners had been trying to escape and get into West Berlin, knowing that if they could get into Allied occupied territory, they could more easily get away to freedom because, again, Berlin is deep within Soviet territory. So Berlin builds this wall Soviets build this wall around West Berlin, making it impossible for anyone to get in and ultimately get out. The Berlin Wall goes up basically overnight. Now, it does start as mostly barbed wire and then eventually will become concrete, and it will become the symbol of the Soviet Union and the divide between the two, which leads to some new alliances that are formed. So these world countries start to realize very quickly that they're going to need to be able to defend each other if we do get to war, because they didn't know the Cold War would never explode, right? For all they knew, the Cold War would blow up into World War III. So this is the foundation of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, also known as NATO. So the big countries that were joining this are the United States, France, Great Britain, Canada, and then 8 other European nations will eventually follow. They had allies in other parts of the world. Eventually, other nations will follow this. But the idea is that these nations get together and say, we will defend each other in the case of Soviet aggression. Now, the Soviets, not to be left out, created their own alliance system known as the Warsaw Pact. And the Warsaw Pact consisted of the Soviet Union and much of Eastern Europe. However, the problem with Eastern Europe right now is that while these countries are technically independent, are they really? Because they are under the strict supervision and really the control of the Soviet Union. So, in a speech given by Winston Churchill, he says that an iron curtain has descended upon Europe. And it means that the world is split into two, the East versus the West, freedom versus democracy. And this is obviously not an actual curtain, it is a metaphor, but it's the idea that the Soviets are slowly extending their control throughout Europe. And that's going to cause problems, and it's going to be the end of democracy, basically. So this sort of becomes, again, the symbol of the Cold War. Keep in mind, the Iron Curtain, not the same thing as the Berlin Wall. Just throwing that out there. So this leads us into the arms race. So what's the problem at the end of World War II? We have nukes. They want nukes. Thanks to spies and scientists and a lot of skullduggery, they get nukes. Well, we get nervous the fact that they have nukes, so we build better nukes, mostly the hydrogen bomb. And the hydrogen bomb is 50 times more powerful than the atom bomb that destroyed Nagasaki and Hiroshima. But what's the problem there? Hey, guess what? They can also build better nukes. So now the Soviets and the United States have nuclear weapons. And we start to threaten each other with our nukes. And this is called mutually assured destruction. And the idea of mutually assured destruction is that, hey, we know we could blow you off the map, but we also know that you could. We could mutually assure that both of us will destroy each other, right? Together, it is certain we will destroy each other. So we kind of agree not to blow each other up. But we are going to keep our hand hovered over the big red button just in case, right? Because we will get if they launch nuclear weapons at us, we will know before they get here. We can launch it back, right? So it's this idea that we're not going to kill each other because we know it would wipe us both off the map. And this is one of the reasons this never descends into actual conflict. Because if we had done this, the world would have ended, right? There's a famous line from Albert Einstein where he says, I do not know what weapons World War III will be fought with, but World War IV will be fought with rocks and sticks. This idea that if a World War III happens, these nuclear weapons are so powerful that we will all die, right? Will blow us back into the prehistoric age. And it almost happens. So in the 1960s, we came as close as we would ever come to this mutually assured destruction with something called the Cuban Missile Crisis. So the United States puts nuclear weapons in Cuba. We get spy satellites that see those nuclear weapons in there, and the United States threatens to attack as a result. And for 13 days, there is this major tension because we know if they release those nukes, it could destroy almost every part of the United States. So from October to, or for several days within, for 13 days within 1963, President John F. Kennedy is basically on the phone with Mikhail Gorbachev saying like, hey, what can we do? How can we do this? And eventually the United States basically gets the Soviet Union to back off. They turn around. One of JFK's advisors says we were playing a game of chicken and they were the first one to blink, right? This almost sets off a nuclear World War III. Luckily, it doesn't, but we get as close as we ever did. Now, the arms race is not the only race that we are fighting. We are also fighting the space race. The space race kind of becomes symbolic of the technological achievement of, the world and technological, like, which is going to be better, democracy or communism. Whoever can get to space first is going to prove that their side is better, right? So the United States and the Soviet Union want to beat each other into space. So there are a lot of reasons that space is important. You could maybe send weapons into space, but like I said, it also shows who is the most powerful. So the Soviet Union manages a lot of first. They send the first satellite into space in 1958 with Sputnik, the first animal, a dog named Laika. Spoiler alert, the dog did not survive. And the first man into space, Yuri Gagarin. So if you look at this, who's winning the space race? Kind of looks like maybe the Soviets. But in 1969, the USA becomes the first to land and this is going to be the most important part of the space race. Now, first of all, yes, it happened. Yes, we actually landed on the moon. There's photographic video evidence, and you can still see the things that we left behind on the moon even to this day. So it is not a conspiracy theory. It did happen. But ultimately, this makes us the quote unquote winner of the space race. So now let's move to Asia. So we've talked a little bit already about the Chinese revolutions, and by the 1950s, China had fallen to communism under Mao Zedong and the Chinese rebels. So the Cold War really begins to heat up in Asia. So China, like I said, becomes communist under Mao Zedong and is seen as quote unquote lost. So they lost China to communism. Many blame President Harry Truman for not doing enough, basically saying, like, you lost China, you could have sent more money or more troops to China, and because you didn't, that's why Mao Zedong was able to take over. And this leads to something known as the domino theory, that if one Asian country falls to communism, they will all fall, much like a series of dominoes. So they decide to use force in order to stop them. And the first attempt at this comes in Korea. So North Korea tries to become communist. This leads to the Korean War and the Korean conflict, in which the United States and the UN get involved and send troops. After 3 years of fighting, Korea is divided into North and South, with the North remaining communist and the South becoming a democratic country, which is the way Korea is still today. North Korea is one of the most closed off countries in the world today, partly as a result of this conflict. So North Korea was a stalemate. It neither won nor lost. Communism stayed in North Korea, so that part of Korea was lost, but the South won. So this was like a half failure, right? But we get another chance in Vietnam. So again, similar situation. Vietnam tries to become communist. The United States gets involved. Unlike the Korean War, the Vietnam War lasts over 10 years and ends not with a victory or a failure, but with a withdrawal. And the United States withdraws in the 1970s. As a result, all of Vietnam falls to communism, so it is lost. But the United States kind of quit, right? Again, the thing about the Cold War in Asia is that this is where the war becomes hot, right? It's not cold, it heats up. And thousands of men die as a result of what? Just trying to keep communism from Asia? It seemed to a lot of people as kind of worthless, which is why the Vietnam War is one of the most unpopular wars in American history. So, as we are moving into the 80s and 90s, the Soviet Union starts to show its weaknesses. So, Gorbachev becomes the premier of the Soviet Union. And when he comes to power, he starts to allow some freedoms that had not really been allowed in the Soviet Union before. The first is perestroika. Perestroika are social freedoms, so things like freedom of speech and freedom of the press. The next is glasnost. Glasnost are economic freedom, so allowing some sort of like capitalism coming into some free market. And as these freedoms start to come to the Soviet Union, they realize that they're not better off than the Americans. Then Ronald Reagan becomes president of the United States. Ronald Reagan is a extreme anti-communism, and he starts to work with Gorbachev. He calls for the fall of the Berlin Wall, and eventually it is torn down in 1989, and Germany is reunited, Berlin is reunited, and we see that as a symbol of freedom and a weakening of the Soviet Union. As the 80s and 90s continue, the Soviet Union starts to lose territory as more and more people begin to rebel. Countries tend to break away from the Soviet control. And in 1991, the Soviet Union is officially dissolved, bringing an end to its 50-year reign, well, really almost 100-year reign. Russia becomes its own country again. Now, you can make the argument that Vladimir Putin thinks the Cold War is still happening. But as far as where the United States stands, the Cold War ended in 1991. So, where are we now? The world lived through a period of intense tension and paranoia, but the world kind of had to find ways to recover after World War II. Now, granted, there has not been a disaster such as World War II since then, but there have been other issues that obviously have come along as a result. And I want to end with this Calvin and Hobbes cartoon. So we've got uh, Calvin and Hobbes here, and Calvin says, I am the fearless American defender of liberty and democracy, and you can be the loathsome, godless communist oppressor. We're at war, so if you get hit with the dart, you're dead, and the other side wins. Okay? Gotcha. Bam! They both hit. Calvin, kind of a stupid game, isn't it? And the Cold War kind of was, right? So this is where we will wrap up, and I will see you next time. Bye.